In the humid lowlands of Adams County, Mississippi, September 1829, an 18-year-old enslaved man named Solomon pushed open the door of his cabin after 16 hours in the tobacco fields and discovered something that should have gotten him killed by sunrise. A white woman, standing in the corner of his dirt floor shack, trembling in an expensive silk dress that cost more than everything in the slave quarters combined. Not just any white woman. Elizabeth Hargrove, the master's wife, alone, after midnight in a slave cabin. This was a death sentence written in the social rules of 1829 Mississippi. A black man alone with a white woman meant lynching, torture, public execution designed to terrify other enslaved people into permanent submission. It didn't matter that Solomon hadn't touched her, hadn't invited her, hadn't done anything except open his own cabin door. Her presence in his space was enough to hang him. Solomon's first instinct was survival. Get her out immediately. Run for an overseer to prove his innocence before someone discovered her here and assumed the worst. But something in Elizabeth Hargrove's face stopped him. She wasn't looking at him with the usual mixture of disdain and indifference that white people reserved for enslaved bodies. She was looking at him with pure terror. Not terror of him, terror of something else. "Please don't scream," Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking so violently she could barely form words. "I need 5 minutes to think. Then I'll leave. They can't find me here." Solomon moved to the gap in the wall that served as a window, scanning the darkness toward the main house. No torches, no search party forming. Not yet. He turned back to this impossible situation, a woman who shouldn't exist in his world, asking him for protection he had no power to give. "Mom, if anyone finds you here, they'll kill me," Solomon said, keeping his voice low and urgent. "They won't ask questions. They won't wait for explanations. They'll just kill me." "I know," Elizabeth said. "That's why I'm begging you for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes for me to figure out what to do." She pulled something from inside her dress, a small leather-bound book, maybe 6 inches tall, and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Her hands shook so hard holding these items that Solomon thought she might drop them. "I found these tonight," Elizabeth continued, her words coming faster now, desperate. "Hidden in my husband's study, under a loose floorboard behind his desk. I wasn't snooping. I swear to God I wasn't snooping. I knocked over his inkwell and it rolled under the desk, and when I reached for it, my hand caught on a loose board. I pulled it up and found these underneath." Solomon didn't understand why she was telling him this. Didn't understand what Master's hidden papers had to do with him, or why this white woman thought a slave cabin was a safe place to hide. But something in her desperation kept him from throwing her out into the night. "What's in them?" he asked against his better judgment. Elizabeth looked up at him then, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since she'd arrived at Hargrove Plantation 3 years earlier. Solomon could see the moment she made her decision, the instant she chose to cross a boundary that could never be uncrossed. "Your mother's name was Naomi, wasn't it?" Elizabeth asked. The world tilted sideways. Solomon felt his breath stop in his chest. "How do you know my mother's name?" "Because it's written in this diary." Judge William Hargrove's private diary, the one he never intended anyone to find. Elizabeth's voice dropped to barely audible. "Solomon, your mother wasn't just a house slave. She was Judge Hargrove's half-sister." The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. Solomon heard them, but his brain refused to process their meaning. "That's impossible," he said. "My mother was born enslaved. She was property from birth. She couldn't have been. She was born in 1789 to a woman named Clara." Elizabeth interrupted, opening the diary with trembling fingers. Clara was enslaved by Judge Robert Hargrove, William's father. Robert noticed Clara when she was 15 years old. He raped her repeatedly over several months. Naomi was born 9 months later. Elizabeth's voice cracked as she continued. "Robert Hargrove knew Naomi was his daughter. He knew it, Solomon. He watched her grow up with his features, his eyes, his intelligence. And he kept her enslaved anyway. Kept his own daughter as property. Made her serve his legitimate white children as if she were livestock. When Robert died in 1815 and William inherited the plantation, he inherited his own half-sister as property." Solomon's legs felt weak. He sat down hard on his corn husk mattress, the only furniture in his cabin besides a wooden crate that served as a table. Elizabeth sat down on the dirt floor across from him, not caring that her silk dress was getting covered in mud. She opened the diary to a page marked with a dried flower and began reading aloud. January 3, 1826. "Naomi approached me today in the hallway when no other servants were present. She asked if it was true that we share the same father. She said her mother Clara told her this on her deathbed last month. I informed Naomi that such matters are irrelevant. The law is clear on this point. One drop of Negro blood makes her property regardless of paternity. I am her master and she is my slave. That is the only relationship the law recognizes. She began crying and begged me to acknowledge her as family. I felt nothing. Father was correct to teach me early that sentiment is the enemy of prosperity in this business. The cabin was spinning. Solomon tried to focus on Elizabeth's face, on the diary in her hands, on anything that would anchor him to reality. But the words kept echoing, one drop of Negro blood makes her property. I felt nothing. There's more, Elizabeth said, tears streaming down her face now, so much more. Your mother married a man named Thomas in 1816. You were born in 1811. When you were 10 years old, Judge Hargrove sold your father south to a cotton plantation in Alabama because Thomas had tried to buy his own freedom. Your mother begged William, her own brother, to intervene. She reminded him they shared the same father. She pleaded for him to show mercy to his nephew. Elizabeth turned to another page, this one with the corner folded down as if someone had marked it for future reference. April 12, 1822. Sold Thomas south today for $800. He had saved $200 toward purchasing his freedom and approached me with a proposal to work off the remaining debt. I found his presumption offensive. Naomi created a scene, screaming at me in front of other slaves that I was selling her husband, my own blood nephew's father. I had her whipped, 10 lashes, to remind her of her station. The boy Solomon is 11 years old now. He has my father's eyes and bone structure. People are beginning to notice. I've decided to isolate him in the far cabin where his resemblance to our family won't raise questions. Solomon couldn't breathe. The cabin walls were closing in. Every memory of his childhood was reforming with this new terrible context. His father being dragged away in chains while his mother screamed. His mother's gradual deterioration over the following years, the light dying in her eyes. The way she would sometimes stare at the main house with an expression Solomon had never understood. Now he realized it was the look of a sister watching her brother live in luxury while she rotted in bondage. His isolation in this cabin, separated from other enslaved families, he'd thought it was punishment for some offense he couldn't remember. Now he understood it was his uncle hiding evidence of the family bloodline that connected them. Before you click away, I need you to understand something. This is episode 9 of Buried Truths, where we document suppressed slavery history from primary sources. What you're hearing right now is reconstructed from actual court documents, plantation diaries, and letters archived in Mississippi and Pennsylvania historical societies. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this story gets even more impossible. And next Saturday at 2 p.m. EST, episode 10 is going to reveal how common this family entanglement was across the South. Subscribe right now. Elizabeth was still reading from the diary, page after page of William Hargrove's cold documentation of his half-sister's suffering. September 19, 1826, Naomi died this morning. The doctor claims it was fever, but I suspect she simply lost the will to live after I sold Thomas. She had been declining for 4 years, refusing to eat properly, working slowly, showing signs of the melancholy that sometimes affects slaves who become too attached to sold family members. The boy Solomon is 13 now and suitable for full field work. I've kept him separated from the other slaves. His resemblance to our family is too pronounced to ignore. Better to keep him isolated where comparisons are less obvious. He'll never know we share blood. That's the kindness I can offer him. Solomon felt something break inside him. His mother hadn't died of fever. She died of a broken heart, destroyed by her own brother's cruelty, by watching her husband sold away and her son treated like an animal by family who should have protected them. Why are you telling me this? Solomon asked, his voice hollow and distant. Why bring this to me? What am I supposed to do with this information? Elizabeth set the diary down and picked up the bundle of letters. Because these letters change everything. They're from Judge Hargrove's cousin, Isaiah Hargrove, who lives in Philadelphia. Isaiah left Mississippi 15 years ago, moved north, and became an abolitionist. The judge kept these letters hidden because they're about something called the Underground Railroad, a network of people who help enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. She untied the ribbon and spread out a dozen letters, written on expensive paper in elegant handwriting. The most recent was dated June 1829, just 3 months earlier. William, I know you consider me a traitor to our family and our race. I know you despise everything I've become, but I'm writing to tell you that my conscience is finally clear after years of guilt. Last month, I personally helped 12 souls escape from a plantation in Louisiana. I met them at a safe house in Natchez, not far from your own property, and guided them north to Tennessee, where other conductors took them further along the route. They are free now, living in Pennsylvania, starting new lives with new names. I have helped 53 people escape bondage since I began this work in 1820. Each one is a small act of redemption for the sins our family committed for generations. I know you'll never respond to these letters. I know you see slave owning as your right and your economic foundation, but I pray someday you'll develop a conscience, and if you ever do, you know how to reach me. Importantly, if any soul currently enslaved on your property ever manages to escape and reach Philadelphia, if they tell me they came from Hargrove Plantation in Adams County, I will help them. I will give them food, shelter, work, and protection. This is my promise, written and witnessed. Elizabeth looked up from the letter, meeting Solomon's eyes. He's waiting for you. He's been waiting for years for someone to make it out. He's your family, Solomon, your uncle's cousin, your blood, and he'll help you escape. Solomon stared at this white woman sitting on his dirt floor, offering him the most dangerous gift imaginable: hope. Hope was a luxury enslaved people couldn't afford. Hope got you killed when it made you reckless. But here it was anyway, in the form of letters and addresses and promises from a man in Philadelphia who helped people escape. Why are you doing this? Solomon asked. Why risk everything to tell me this? You could just put the diary back, pretend you never found it, go back to your comfortable life. Elizabeth's laugh was bitter and broken. Because I just realized my comfortable life is built on horror. My husband owns his own nephew. His father enslaved and raped his own daughter. And I've been living in that house for 3 years, eating food prepared by enslaved people, wearing dresses sewn by enslaved hands, sleeping in a bed made with enslaved labor, telling myself I'm a good Christian woman who treats her servants kindly. She wiped tears from her face with the back of her hand. I can't give you back your mother. I can't undo what's been done to you and your father and everyone else suffering on this plantation, but I can give you this information. I can give you this choice. There's a man in Philadelphia who will help you escape. There's a route. They call it the Underground Railroad. And if you want to try, I won't stop you. I'll help you. For the next 3 hours, until the sky started turning gray with pre-dawn light, Solomon and Elizabeth Hargrove planned something that should have been impossible. Two people from opposite sides of the slavery system, connected by blood neither of them had chosen, plotting escape from the very structure that defined their lives. Elizabeth explained what she knew from Isaiah's letters. The Underground Railroad operated through a network of safe houses spaced roughly 20 to 30 miles apart. Conductors, people who guided escapees, would move them from house to house, traveling at night, hiding during the day. The route from Mississippi to Pennsylvania took weeks, sometimes months, depending on how many delays and detours were necessary to avoid slave catchers. Isaiah's last letter mentions a contact in Natchez, Elizabeth said, pointing to a name written in the margin. Samuel Chen, who runs a laundry service near the river. He's one of the conductors. If you can get to Natchez, it's only 15 miles from here. Samuel can connect you to the next point on the route. Solomon's mind was racing through logistics and dangers. If I run, they'll organize search parties immediately. They'll use dogs to track me. The patrollers will be watching every road between here and Natchez. That's why we need time to plan, Elizabeth said. The Harvest Festival is in 2 weeks, September 28th. Judge Hargrove always gets drunk during the festival, so do the overseers. Security becomes relaxed because they're celebrating. If we're going to do this, that's our best chance. They spent the remaining time before dawn working out details that could mean the difference between freedom and death. Elizabeth would steal money gradually from the judge's safe. Small amounts he wouldn't notice immediately, $5 here, $10 there, accumulating enough to pay for food and passage along the escape route. She would copy the judge's map of Mississippi and Tennessee, marking routes and towns that might offer hiding places. Solomon would identify other enslaved people he trusted absolutely. People who might want to risk the run north. People who could keep secrets even under torture. He'd spend the next 2 weeks observing patrol patterns, noting which overseers drank heavily and which stayed alert, identifying the weakest points in the plantation's perimeter where escape would be most possible. How do we know Isaiah will really help? Solomon asked as the first real light started creeping through the gaps in his cabin walls. How do we know these letters aren't just words he writes to torment the judge? Elizabeth pulled out the most recent letter again, dated August 15, 1829, just 1 month earlier. She pointed to the final paragraph. William, I know you see me as a traitor, but I want you to know this: my door is always open. If any soul currently enslaved on your property ever makes it to Philadelphia and tells me they came from Hargrove Plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, I will help them. I will feed them, clothe them, find them work, help them build free lives. This is my promise, written and witnessed before God. And William, if you ever develop a conscience, that offer extends to you too. It's never too late to stop participating in evil. He's waiting for us, Elizabeth whispered. He's been waiting for years for someone to make it out. We just have to get there. As full dawn broke, Elizabeth checked carefully through the cabin's gaps before slipping outside. Solomon watched her hurry toward the main house, her expensive dress now filthy with cabin dirt, her hair still loose and tangled. She looked back once before disappearing around the corner, and Solomon saw in her face the same desperate determination he felt in his own chest. He sat alone in his cabin, holding his mother's memory and this new impossible knowledge. He was a Hargrove. His blood carried the same family line as the judge who enslaved him. His mother had died begging her own brother for mercy that never came. And in 2 weeks, if everything went according to plan, he was going to escape. The 14 days between that September night and the harvest festival were the longest of Solomon's life. Every morning he woke expecting to find Elizabeth had changed her mind or been discovered. Every evening he returned from the fields expecting to be arrested and tortured for a conspiracy someone had betrayed. But the days passed with agonizing slowness and routine brutality. Solomon worked the tobacco harvest with new awareness, seeing everything through the lens of someone preparing to run. He memorized the overseer's schedule changes, midnight and 6 a.m. He noted which dogs were chained at night and which ran loose. He identified weak spots in the split, rail fence that marked the plantation's boundaries. And carefully, in moments of invisibility that enslaved people learned to create, he spoke to 3 other people. Marcus was 22 years old, a field worker whose wife Jenny had been sold south to Alabama the previous year. When Solomon approached him during a water break and whispered the possibility of escape, Marcus's response was immediate. My wife is somewhere in Alabama. Maybe if I get free, I can find her. Even if I can't, I'd rather die trying to be free than live one more year like this. I'm in. Ruth was 19, a house worker who'd been repeatedly assaulted by the head overseer. Solomon had watched her spirits slowly break over the past year, watched her withdraw into silence and dissociation. When he told her about the escape plan, something rekindled in her eyes. If we fail, they'll torture us, she said quietly. They'll make examples of us. Solomon nodded. They're already torturing us. Every day we're here, we're being tortured. At least this way we have a chance. Ruth thought for a long moment, then said, I'm in. The third person was 14-year-old Isaiah, named by his mother after some white family member she'd heard mentioned in the big house. Young Isaiah was sharp and quick, small enough to be underestimated but smart enough to survive by staying invisible. When Solomon explained the plan, the boy's eyes went wide with desperate hope. You really think we could make it? All the way to Pennsylvania? Solomon wanted to be honest. I think we have help. Real help from someone who's done this before. And I think if we don't try, we'll die here eventually anyway. At least this way we choose how we face death, running toward freedom instead of waiting for it to break us. Young Isaiah nodded slowly. I'm in. 4 people. It was a small group, but any larger and the risk of betrayal multiplied exponentially. In the world of slavery, where torture could extract information from anyone, the fewer people who knew about the plan, the better the chances of survival. Turn on that notification bell right now if you haven't already, because what I'm about to tell you about the escape itself is documented in court records from Adams County, Mississippi, dated September 29, 1829. This actually happened. These 4 people actually attempted this. Subscribe and hit that bell so you're here next Saturday at 2 p.m. EST for episode 10, where we're going to expose how common mixed race bloodlines were in slaveholding families and how far they went to hide that reality. Elizabeth played her part perfectly over those 2 weeks. She stole money in small increments. $5 from the judge's coat pocket, $10 from the household account, $8 from a drawer in his study. By September 27th, she had accumulated $47, a substantial sum that could buy food passage and bribes along the escape route. She smuggled food from the kitchen in amounts too small to be noticed immediately. Dried beef, hardtack, cornbread wrapped in cloth. She hid these supplies in an old trunk in the unused guest bedroom, building a cache that would sustain 4 people for the first dangerous days of flight. Most importantly, she copied the judge's map. Late at night when William Hargrove was drunk and sleeping, Elizabeth snuck into his study and carefully traced his maps of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. She marked the route to Natchez, noted towns along the way, indicated where rivers might be forded or where roads intersected. She also began leaving subtle preparations for after the escape. Nothing obvious, but small clues that might help explain her actions if investigators looked carefully. She returned the diary and letters to their hiding place under the floorboard, but left one page bookmarked. The entry about Naomi begging her brother for mercy. She wrote a coded letter to her sister in Virginia, vague enough to seem innocent but specific enough to serve as testimony if everything went wrong. September 28, 1829, the Harvest Festival. Enslaved people on Hargrove Plantation had learned to view the Harvest Festival with complicated emotions. It was one day each year when work demands slightly relaxed, when they were allowed to gather in the evening, sometimes even given extra food rations. It was the plantation owners' calculated method of releasing pressure, give the enslaved population one night of semi-freedom to prevent rebellion the other 364 days. The festival started at sunset. A pig had been slaughtered and was roasting over an open fire. The judge broke out barrels of beer for the white overseers and even allowed small amounts of alcohol to reach the enslaved community. Music started. Someone had a fiddle. Someone else had a drum made from a hollowed log. Voices rose in songs that carried both celebration and mourning. Judge William Hargrove and his overseer friends started drinking at noon and by sunset were loud and careless, exactly as Solomon had predicted. They sat on the veranda of the main house, drinking bourbon and laughing about cotton prices and political gossip, paying less and less attention to the activities in the slave quarters as the evening progressed. At 10 p.m., when the music and dancing were at their peak, Solomon slipped away from the celebration. 5 minutes later, Marcus followed, then Ruth, then young Isaiah. They moved separately, using different paths, meeting at Solomon's isolated cabin where Elizabeth was already waiting. She had everything organized with methodical precision. 4 bundles of food, each wrapped in cloth and tied securely. The $47 divided into 4 amounts, $15 each for the adults, $17 for young Isaiah, who would need more resources as a child traveling alone if they got separated. The copied map, carefully folded and sealed in waxed cloth to protect it from water. And the letter. The sealed letter addressed to Isaiah Hargrove in Philadelphia, explaining everything, asking for help. Elizabeth's careful handwriting. The patrol schedule changes at midnight, Elizabeth whispered, handing out the supplies. You'll have a 6-hour window before they realize you're gone and can organize a chase. I've arranged a distraction to buy you extra time. When you see the fire start, run. Don't look back. Just run north. What about you? Solomon asked, the question he'd been holding for 2 weeks. When they discover you helped us, I'm going to tell them you kidnapped me at knife point. Elizabeth interrupted. Her voice was steady now, resolved. I'm going to scream and cry and tell them you forced me to give you money and supplies. They'll believe me because I'm white and you're not. It will buy you hours, maybe a full day before they realize I'm lying. They'll still punish you, Ruth said quietly. Even if they believe your story, they'll say you were careless to be caught alone. Elizabeth's smile was sad and knowing. I know, but I'll survive. You 4 won't survive if you don't leave right now. She handed Solomon the final item, the sealed letter to Isaiah Hargrove. If you make it to Philadelphia, give him this. It explains who you are, what happened here, what I found in the diary. He'll help you. I believe that with everything I have. Solomon took the letter and looked at this woman who had crossed every boundary their society had constructed. Connected by blood neither had chosen, separated by a racial hierarchy neither had created, choosing in this moment to become allies in the most fundamental battle of their time. Thank you, Solomon said. The words felt inadequate for what she'd risked, but they were all he had. Go, Elizabeth whispered. And don't stop until you're free. They ran. 4 people, Solomon, Marcus, Ruth, and young Isaiah, disappeared into the Mississippi night. They followed the North Star, visible through breaks in the cloud cover, moving through cotton fields and tobacco fields and patches of forest. They carried 47 stolen dollars, several days of food, 1 copied map, and 1 sealed letter. Behind them, at 11:30 p.m., exactly as planned, fire erupted in the plantation's tobacco barn. Elizabeth had prepared this final act of sabotage with the same careful precision she'd brought to all her planning. Earlier that afternoon, while everyone was preparing for the festival, she'd moved hay bales closer to an oil lamp in the barn. She'd positioned them carefully, creating a delayed ignition that would give the escapees time to get away before the alarm sounded. The fire wasn't large enough to spread to the main house or slave quarters. Elizabeth wasn't trying to commit mass murder, but it was large enough to create chaos and confusion. Large enough that every overseer and the judge himself had to respond immediately. Large enough that no one noticed 4 missing enslaved people until dawn broke and the daily roll call revealed the absence. By the time Judge William Hargrove discovered his wife in the guest bedroom, dress torn and dirty, crying hysterically and claiming she'd been kidnapped at knife point by his field hand Solomon, the 4 escapees had a 9-hour head start. Click that subscribe button right now if you want to know what happened to them. Seriously, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and be here next Saturday at 2 p.m. EST, because episode 10 is going to reveal how often this kind of escape succeeded, how the Underground Railroad really operated, and what happened to people who were caught. This is episode 9 and the story isn't over. The manhunt began at dawn on September 29th. Judge William Hargrove filed official runaway notices with the Adams County Sheriff, offering $100 reward for each escapee, a massive sum that indicated both the judge's wealth and his desperation to recapture them. The notices described Solomon as 6 feet 2 inches tall, powerfully built, light brown complexion, unusually intelligent, may try to pass as free. The description of his light complexion and intelligence were inadvertent admissions of his mixed race heritage, though the judge never acknowledged that publicly. Marcus, Ruth, and young Isaiah were described in dehumanizing detail that reduced them to marketable characteristics: strong field worker, skilled house servant, quick and intelligent boy. The notices were posted throughout Adams County and distributed to neighboring counties. Professional slave catchers were hired. Dogs were brought in to track the scent. But Solomon and his companions had 9 hours of lead time, and they used it well. They reached Natchez by dawn. Exhausted and terrified but moving fast, Samuel Chen, the laundry operator Isaiah Hargrove had mentioned in his letters, found them hiding near the river docks at sunrise. He asked one question: "Where from?" Solomon answered, "Hargrove Plantation, Adams County." Samuel nodded once and said, "Come with me." For the next 8 weeks, Solomon, Marcus, Ruth, and young Isaiah moved through the Underground Railroad network. They traveled at night, hidden in wagons during the day, moved from safe house to safe house by conductors who risked everything to help them. They crossed Mississippi into Tennessee, worked their way through Kentucky, where slave catchers were especially vigilant. They crossed the Ohio River into free territory, though freedom was complicated when the Fugitive Slave Act meant they could still be captured and returned south. The journey was brutal. They went days without adequate food. They slept in barns and cellars and hidden rooms. Ruth developed fever in Kentucky and nearly died before a free black family nursed her back to health. Young Isaiah's feet blistered so badly he could barely walk for a week. But they kept moving north, driven by the memory of what they'd left behind and the hope of what might be possible ahead. In late November 1829, 4 exhausted, half-starved people arrived at a house in Philadelphia's free black community. They knocked on the door, and when it opened, Solomon said to the white man standing there, "Are you Isaiah Hargrove?" The man studied them for a long moment, then said, "I am." "Where are you from?" Solomon pulled out the sealed letter, now dirty and worn from 2 months of travel. "Hargrove Plantation, Adams County, Mississippi. Your cousin William, we have a letter from Elizabeth." Isaiah Hargrove's diary, preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives, records that day, November 28, 1829. "Today I met my nephew, Solomon, son of my cousin Naomi, daughter of my uncle Robert. He arrived at my door after 2 months of dangerous travel with 3 other souls from William's plantation. He carried a letter from Elizabeth, William's wife, explaining everything: the diary, the family connection, the choice she made to help them escape. I read the letter 3 times, barely believing what it revealed. My uncle Robert raped an enslaved woman and kept his own daughter as property. William inherited his half-sister as a slave and worked his own nephew like an animal. The evil of our family runs deeper than I imagined. But today, that evil ends for these 4 people. Solomon is free now. They all are. I've found them housing, work, and new names. As far as the South is concerned, they vanished. As far as freedom is concerned, they're just beginning to live." Solomon lived to age 73. He married a free black woman named Hannah in 1832. They had 6 children. Solomon worked as a carpenter in Philadelphia, building furniture and homes, earning wages for his labor for the first time in his life. He never returned to Mississippi. His descendants are alive today, free people who exist because an 18-year-old enslaved man and one morally awakened white woman made an impossible choice in September 1829. Marcus never found his wife Jenny. She had died in Alabama 2 years after being sold south, though Marcus didn't learn this until 1845. He mourned her for the rest of his life but built a new life in Philadelphia anyway. He worked in factories, married in 1838, had 2 children. He died in 1876, having lived more than half his life as a free man. Ruth found healing slowly in Philadelphia. She worked as a seamstress, eventually running her own dressmaking business that employed other free black women. She never married but created a chosen family among the community of formerly enslaved people who'd escaped north. She died in 1881, age 71. Young Isaiah became a teacher. He dedicated his life to educating formerly enslaved people and their children, running a small school in Philadelphia that operated for 40 years. He died in 1893, having taught more than 3,000 students to read and write. What happened to Elizabeth Hargrove? Judge William Hargrove believed her kidnapping story initially. She had performed her part perfectly. Torn dress, bruised arms from self-inflicted injuries, hysterical crying, detailed descriptions of being forced at knife point to provide money and supplies. For several months, William accepted this narrative. But as time passed and details didn't quite align, suspicion grew. Why had Elizabeth been in the slave quarters alone at night? Why hadn't she screamed when Solomon allegedly kidnapped her? How had 4 slaves disappeared simultaneously if only Solomon was involved? And why, when investigators checked his study, was one particular floorboard loose, the one where his diary and Isaiah's letters had been hidden? By March 1830, Judge Hargrove confronted his wife directly. He found the diary page that had been bookmarked. He noticed that money had been disappearing from his accounts for weeks before the escape. He realized the fire in the tobacco barn had been deliberate, timed perfectly to create distraction. William Hargrove never publicly accused his wife of helping slaves escape. To do so would have required admitting his family secrets, that his father had raped an enslaved woman, that his half-sister had been his property, that his own nephew had been one of the escapees. Southern honor culture made such admissions impossible. Instead, he filed for legal separation in March 1830, citing irreconcilable differences in behavior unbecoming a wife. Elizabeth was sent to live with her family in Virginia, effectively banished from Mississippi society. She received a small allowance but was forbidden from ever returning to Hargrove Plantation. Elizabeth Hargrove lived the remaining 37 years of her life in Richmond, Virginia. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about what happened in September 1829, but she kept correspondence with Isaiah Hargrove in Philadelphia until her death in 1867. And through those letters she learned that Solomon and his companions had survived, had built lives, had become free. Her grave in Richmond's Hollywood Cemetery has a simple marker. Elizabeth Hargrove, 1805-1867. She showed mercy. The choice of epitaph was specified in her will, written in her own hand. It was her final testimony, carefully worded to avoid explicit admission but clear enough that anyone who knew the story would understand. Judge William Hargrove died in 1856, age 61, having never acknowledged Solomon as family, never expressed remorse for enslaving his half-sister, never admitted the evil documented in his hidden diary. That diary remained hidden under the floorboard until 1891, when the plantation house was being demolished and a worker discovered it. The diary eventually made its way to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, where it remains today, cataloged and available to researchers.